A boss betrays loyal workers, but his empire collapses when they leave. The city rose like a forest of towers, steel and glass shimmering in the sunlight. At the center of it all stood one empire, commanded by a man whose pride was his crown and arrogance his armor. His name was Victor Darnell, a tycoon who clawed his way from the dirt to the throne of industry. Yet for all his brilliance, Victor had a flaw greater than any weakness. He believed people were tools, nothing more. Under his rule, workers labored until exhaustion broke them, their loyalty rewarded with empty promises. They endured because they believed that one day their sacrifices would be recognized. But Victor never intended to honor their devotion. He thrived on control, and he relished the power he held over them. Little did Victor know the foundations of his empire were not built on stone, but on fragile trust. Each ignored voice, each broken promise, each betrayal was a crack in the walls he thought unshakable. And like all who wear the mask of invincibility too long, he would discover that arrogance always demands a price. The workers of Darnell Enterprises were not ordinary men and women. They were dreamers who sacrificed their futures for the promise of shared success. Among them were foremen who worked through freezing nights, architects who drafted wonders without credit, and builders who wore scars like medals of loyalty. They were shadows who carried Victor's empire on their backs. For years they endured the impossible. They ignored hunger, fatigue, and even the cruelty of their master because they believed his vision might one day be theirs too. They whispered encouragement to one another, sharing fragments of hope in break rooms that smelled of rust and sweat. But over time, those whispers became questions. Why were their sacrifices unnoticed? Why did Victor live in a palace of gold while they fought for bread? Why did his promises of bonuses, shares, and recognition vanish into silence? The shadows grew restless. Though they did not yet know it, they were standing at the edge of rebellion. Loyalty, once their chain, was turning into fire. Victor's arrogance reached its peak when he summoned his workers to the grand hall of his headquarters. With a voice that echoed like steel striking stone, he announced the truth. There would be no bonuses, no shares, no recognition. Their sacrifices were his by right, and his empire belonged to him alone. The words struck harder than any whip. Men who had broken bones for him stood silent in disbelief. Women who had sacrificed years of family life trembled with rage. For a moment the silence was heavier than thunder. As if the walls themselves could not bear the weight of his betrayal, Victor smiled at their shock. He mistook their silence for submission, their bowed heads for obedience. In his arrogance he failed to see the fire in their eyes, the storm gathering in their hearts. That night, when the workers left the hall, they did not return to their duties with the same loyalty. They carried with them a wound too deep to heal, and in its place a decision began to form, a decision that would bring Victor's empire to its knees. The collapse did not begin with chaos but with silence. One by one the workers began to leave. They stopped showing up at construction sites, abandoned their desks, and vanished from the corridors. Victor noticed the empty stations but dismissed them with arrogance. "Fools," he said. "If they leave, another 100 will crawl to replace them." But no replacements came. His reputation had spread like wildfire. No one wanted to work for a tyrant who devoured loyalty and rewarded sacrifice with betrayal. Contracts began to dissolve. Clients grew nervous as projects halted. Investors whispered doubts behind closed doors. Yet Victor remained blind. He believed his empire untouchable, built too high for the world to shake. But an empire without workers is nothing more than hollow stone. Every day, another piece of his empire crumbled into dust, until the man who once stood surrounded by loyalty found himself alone in his palace of mirrors, staring at his reflection, and for the first time he saw cracks forming there too. The first true collapse came suddenly, like a storm breaking the sky. A skyscraper project that was meant to crown Victor's achievements was left unfinished, the steel skeleton looming like a graveyard monument. Investors pulled out, fearing losses they could not recover. Victor raged against them, but his voice no longer carried power. Without workers, without trust, he was a king without subjects. Lawsuits piled up like shadows at his door, creditors demanded payment, and former allies became vultures circling his empire. And yet, through all this, Victor refused to admit defeat. His arrogance was a shield he clung to desperately. He shouted that he would rebuild, that he would hire new armies, that his empire was eternal. But every word was a lie, and deep down he felt the truth clawing at him. His downfall was not caused by enemies from outside, it was born from within, from the betrayal he dealt to those who once would have died for him. His empire was no longer collapsing, it was rotting, and soon it would be nothing but dust. It began with a message chain created after midnight, a quiet string of names that had once signed away weekends and sleep for promises that never arrived. At the top of the list was Lila Serrano, the analytical heartbeat of the engineering division. Below her, Tomas Yusuf, who could turn chaos into blueprints, then Ren Park, a site captain whose crew would follow him into a storm. They were not agitators, they were believers whose belief had been squandered. The plan was not revenge, it was escape with purpose. They would form a consortium, pooling skill and reputation to finish the halted projects under fair contracts and transparent books. Their proposition to clients was simple. We'll deliver what you were promised, no palaces, no yachts to feed. Risky, yes, but their names carried weight that Victor had never truly understood. He thought loyalty meant possession, they knew loyalty meant trust. They met in kitchens and parking lots, shared spreadsheets over encrypted drives, and agreed that their new venture would never repeat the old sins. Profit would not outrank people. Deadlines would not devour lives. Mistakes would be owned, fixed, and learned from. The consortium filed its papers quietly. Like a sunrise you don't notice until the room is warm. One by one, clients replied, cautiously at first, then eagerly. The first contract arrived with 3 signatures and a clause about worker wellness that made Lila cry in silence. The second came with a retainer wired at dawn. The third carried a handwritten note, "We trusted you before we feared him." On the 51st floor of his headquarters, Victor paced beneath chandeliers that glittered like frozen rain. The glass walls reflected a man at war with an invisible enemy. He called it sabotage, called it theft, called it slander, anything but the name it deserved, consequence. The news cycle turned carnivorous. An investigative column laid bare the culture inside Darnell Holdings. Unpaid overtime, vanishing incentives, public praise paired with private threats. Photographs of dim break rooms and exhausted crews ran beside glossy shots of Victor's charity galas, a contrast so sharp it drew blood. Investors did not need courage to flee, they needed only excuses, and the headlines delivered them hourly. He fired his communications chief, then rehired her 2 days later to fire her again. He demanded lists of loyalists, and learned those lists were shorter than the reports of who had left. Suppliers tightened credit like a fist. City inspectors returned to previously expedited sites with clipboards and new questions. Victor tried to create noise, a press conference with grand promises, a donation to a museum wing, a limited-time bonus that was neither limited nor a real bonus. But noise cannot drown out silence when the silence is empty floors and frozen cranes. At night he stood alone in his office, city lights pricking the dark like distant eyes. He whispered to the windows, "I made you all." And the windows, mute and cold, reflected a man who did not recognize the architect of his own isolation. The crack that became a canyon arrived as a spreadsheet, numbers laid out like a confession. It was not stolen. It was compiled from the company's own public filings and internal memos that workers had archived over the years to protect themselves. Lila and Tomas didn't publish it. They handed it to a trade association that had once funded Victor's panels and dinners. The association delivered it to auditors whose patience had been quietly thinning for months. The ledger, as the press named it, told a simple story. Funds redirected from employee incentive pools to executive retention programs. Supplier invoices negotiated down but never paid on time. Safety budgets trimmed whenever deadlines tightened. Nothing illegal enough to handcuff on day one, but corrosive, systemic, undeniable. It replaced rumor with arithmetic. When asked for comment, Victor called it creative accounting and smiled, a smile that looked like a grimace that had forgotten how to hide. But the math did not blink. Project partners started inserting clawback clauses. Banks reevaluated covenants. The consortium, by contrast, allowed cameras into their meetings, whiteboards filled with timelines, workers discussing risks openly, contracts that spelled out overtime and protections. Public opinion did not simply shift, it slid, like wet stone underfoot. Some who had once envied Victor now pitied him. Pity is a colder verdict than anger because it suggests the end is not a battle but a dwindling. In boardrooms and living rooms, a conclusion hardened. His empire hadn't fallen to enemies, it had surrendered to the truth written in its own books. The blackout began at a waterfront site when a temporary generator failed and no replacement arrived. Crews waiting on instructions drifted away. A crane operator, unpaid for 6 weeks, left his key on the seat and walked into the wind, hands empty and free. Across town, a fabrication plant paused production because the steel Victor had promised to prepay never cleared the dock. Wire first, the supplier said. The wire never came. That night, emails poured into Victor's inbox with subject lines that sounded like funeral bells. Hold request, withdrawal notice, default alert. He replied to each with a Dominion's certainty, But the words carried no currency. Even the elevators in his tower stuttered as maintenance contracts lapsed. He started taking the stairs out of spite and breathlessness. Meanwhile, the consortium turned their first sight into a manifesto. They hung a banner that read, "Built with care," and made the safety brief a daily ritual. When a design flaw surfaced, they filmed the fix and posted it, naming the mistake and the repair team who solved it. Clients who visited found an ordinary miracle. A job site where people were neither invisible nor afraid. Victor ordered his last loyal deputy to do something public. The deputy suggested listening, suggested apologies, suggested amends. Victor dismissed him with a wave wide enough to sweep away the final bridge. And so the night lengthened. Lights stayed off. In the darkness, the skeletons of unfinished towers looked like questions that no longer wanted his answers. He stopped sleeping. He tried to outwork the collapse, as if willpower could solder a severed circuit. But willpower builds nothing without hands, and the hands were gone. In the dull blue hour before dawn, Victor discovered a terrifying quiet. No messages, no meetings, no fires to stomp, just silence and the ache of a story he could not edit. He walked the hall where portraits of his past triumphs lined the wall. The frames seemed heavier, gilded weights for achievements that would not lift him now. He remembered names he had mispronounced on purpose, birthdays he had ignored, the foreman he had humiliated for daring to ask about profit sharing. He thought of calling Lila. He even drafted the first sentence, "I was wrong," and watched the blinking cursor like a metronome measuring a courage he did not yet possess. He closed the window. Outside, the consortium held a small gathering to mark their first completed milestone. No champagne, no stage lights, just paper cups, a homemade cake, and a roll call of gratitude. Ren thanked a young apprentice for catching an error before the rebar went in. Tomas thanked the night crew for staying until the math balanced. Lila spoke last and said, "Decency is not a perk, it's the plan." Victor saw a clip of it on his phone, a shaky video with bad audio and radiant faces. He pressed replay. Again. Somewhere in him, a hinge loosened. He realized a mirror is useless without a frame. Reflection needs a boundary, a shape made by others. And he had broken every frame. The storm of collapse did not slow. It sharpened. Creditors returned with sharpened contracts. Clients returned with demands for damages. Former allies returned not as partners, but as plaintiffs. Courtrooms filled with echoes of names Victor had once dismissed. Each appearance was a reminder. Loyalty discarded always comes back, but never as it left. Reporters stood like sentinels outside his headquarters. The empire that once dazzled them now fed their headlines with daily ruin. Executives depart, projects seized, court orders filed. The stories multiplied, feeding on his arrogance like carrion birds. Victor began speaking less in public. His arrogance, once a roar, retreated into muttering monologues in empty offices. He no longer used his title. He no longer believed in it. The papers called him the former magnate before his empire had fully died. That word, former, gnawed at him more than debt collectors ever could. And yet, even in ruin, he searched for a way back. He told himself he could return if given one more chance, one more contract, one more crew willing to sweat for him. But there was no return. Betrayal, once spoken, writes itself into history. It does not erase and it does not forget. While Victor fought shadows, the consortium moved with deliberate grace. Their first completed project stood as more than architecture. It was proof. Clients visited and saw not only walls and beams but also trust carved into every decision. Workers wore uniforms not of servitude but of pride. Their names known, their labor valued. Word spread not through marketing, but through whispers of relief. They listen, they keep their promises, they finish what they start. Soon contracts stacked higher than any tower Victor had ever imagined. The consortium grew, not as a kingdom, but as a community. Leadership rotated. Votes decided direction. Profits were shared. And when mistakes happened, they were fixed without shame. Investors who once trembled under Victor's thunder now walked into modest rooms with folding chairs and chose stability over spectacle. They poured money not into gold-plated boardrooms but into hands that built futures. The workers who had once been shadows found themselves in the light. Their stories, their names, their dignity became part of the architecture itself. They were no longer the forgotten. They were the foundation. And unlike Victor's empire, their foundation was built not of stone but of people. Victor's headquarters, once a gleaming monument of glass and marble, became the stage for humiliation. A court-ordered auction stripped it bare. Conference tables sold for pennies. Artwork was carried out under sheets. Even the chandeliers that had once lit his arrogance were dismantled piece by piece. He stood in the crowd, disguised under a cap, watching strangers haggle over his empire's bones. When the auctioneer raised his personal desk for bidding, Victor remembered every deal signed upon it. every promise broken, every betrayal sealed with his pen. A stranger bought it for less than the cost of a month's rent. The humiliation did not end there. His penthouse, his cars, his vacation estate by the cliffs, all gone in quick succession. Newspapers captured the spectacle with glee. "Empire in ashes," read the headlines, accompanied by photos of his properties stripped of grandeur. Victor walked away empty-handed, pockets heavy only with debts and memories. The world he had built was gone, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet scrape of gavel after gavel. His empire had not fallen like a monument toppling, it had been sold like scraps at a marketplace. One afternoon, on a gray street corner, Victor crossed paths with Ren Park. The foreman stopped, stunned. While Victor lowered his head as if bracing for a blow, instead Ren spoke softly. "You could have had it all, Victor. We would have carried you to the stars. But you thought you were the stars." Victor tried to respond, but the words lodged in his throat. His empire, his wealth, his arrogance, none of it could shield him now. Ren walked on, his shoulders squared with pride, while Victor stood like a shadow against a wall, invisible to those who passed. That encounter lingered in Victor's mind like a bruise. He replayed it endlessly, not because of the rebuke, but because Ren's voice carried something he had forgotten existed: sincerity. It was not anger, not mockery, not pity, just truth. For the first time, Victor wondered what it might have been like to lead differently, to hold loyalty as treasure instead of chains. The thought did not soothe him, it hollowed him, a reminder that the empire he lost had never truly been his to begin with. Silence became Victor's companion. His phone, once a storm of demands and opportunities, now sat cold. No more investors, no more workers, no more sycophants laughing at jokes they didn't find funny. Only silence. He wandered through smaller apartments, each one emptier than the last, filling his nights with television static and memories that refused to soften. Sometimes he would walk past construction sites, watching men and women in hard hats laugh as they worked under the banners of the consortium. He wanted to shout, to remind them of what he had built, but the words tasted like dust before they ever left his lips. Silence is heavier than noise. It presses on the chest, it tightens the throat, it drowns the mind. Victor learned that the weight of betrayal is not only in losing others, it is in losing the sound of one's own name spoken with respect. And so he sat in the quiet, haunted by the echo of promises he had never kept. Silence was not punishment enough, but it was relentless. Years passed. The consortium became a cornerstone of the city, their projects reshaping skylines and lives alike. Their legacy was not measured in skyscrapers alone, but in the culture they nurtured. Apprentices became leaders. Former shadows became voices shaping policy. Workers were not nameless, they were celebrated. Documentaries were made about their rise, university lectures dissected their model, and communities used their framework as a template for justice in other industries. The consortium model became a term, a symbol of what happens when trust replaces tyranny. Victor's name was still spoken, but only as a warning. Professors cited him as a case study in arrogance. Journalists wrote about him as a man who had everything but squandered it all on ego. His name became synonymous with betrayal, a cautionary tale engraved into textbooks and whispered in boardrooms, "Don't be a Darnell." The workers who had once been forgotten were now immortalized not as victims, but as pioneers. Their story belonged to them, and they told it proudly. The empire they built was not an empire at all, it was a legacy alive and breathing. Victor grew older. His hair thinned, his eyes dimmed, his shoulders sagged under years of regret. Once he had worn a crown invisible but undeniable, a crown of arrogance that no one dared to question. Now, that crown was cracked, jagged, and cutting into his very skin. He lived in obscurity, surviving on the remnants of savings untouched by lawsuits, watching the world move on without him. Occasionally he would see interviews of Lila, Tomas, or Ren speaking about leadership, about loyalty, about lessons learned. He could not escape their faces, nor the memory of the day he betrayed them. Victor understood too late that betrayal is not the end of others, it is the end of oneself. His workers had thrived without him, his empire had collapsed without them. The crown he once cherished had turned into chains that bound him to regret. In desperation, Victor tried once more to rise. He pitched to small investors, promising he had learned. But the rooms were cold, the handshakes reluctant, the contracts unsigned. No one trusted a man whose legacy was betrayal. The few who listened saw the desperation in his eyes, the hollow echo of promises too often broken. Even when he lowered his voice, humbled his tone, and offered transparency, the shadow of his past clung to him like tar. He left those rooms each time with empty hands and a heavier heart. The world had moved on, his time was gone, his betrayal had written the final chapter, and no apology could rewrite it. The empire of Victor Darnell did not end with fire, nor with rage. It ended with emptiness. His buildings still stood, but they belonged to others. His name was still remembered, but only as a ghost story. His life became a long corridor with locked doors, each one bearing the face of a worker he had wronged. The man who once commanded armies of loyalty now sat in a room alone, his crown shattered, his voice unheard. He had built monuments of steel and glass, but none of them could save him from the truth. Without loyalty, without respect, without trust, no empire can endure. One night, as rain lashed against the windows of his small apartment, Victor stared into a cracked mirror. He no longer saw the Titan who once commanded a city. He saw a man undone by arrogance, a figure abandoned not by chance, but by choice. He whispered to his reflection, "I betrayed them all, and in the end they betrayed me by leaving." But the mirror, indifferent and cruel, reflected the truth he refused to accept. They had not betrayed him, he had destroyed himself. Far away, under brighter lights, the consortium celebrated another milestone. Laughter rose into the night, carried by winds that no arrogance could silence. Their story was no longer about what they had survived, but about what they had built together. And so the tale ends not with the rise of an arrogant boss, but with the triumph of loyalty reclaimed, trust restored, and justice written in stone. If you found this story captivating, filled with lessons of power, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that echo through time.